Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. There's still some stragglers coming in, but as my mother said, never start too late. So we're starting. Welcome. My name is Antoine van Akmaal. I chair an investment firm that focuses on emerging markets, and am a Brookings trustee. I'm honored and delighted to welcome you here this morning to Brookings on behalf of the Board of Trustees. Not in the least because I come from a very small country where trade is 66% of GDP, the Netherlands. And I've spent my entire professional career trying to figure out competitive edge. And this is what we are going to talk about today. Today, Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program releases its Export Nation 2012, a follow-up of a first report they did in 2010. And it aims to demonstrate two things. First, the key role that exports play in the recovery, in economic life, and frankly, in job creation. But second of all, and in my mind even more important, is it takes the focus away from the top down to the bottom up and focuses on the 100 largest metropolitan areas. In other words, it gives you some numbers at the sub-macro level that are really missing. And it's enormous credit, I think, to this group that they have put them together because they're useful. So congratulations to Emilia, Nicholas, and the entire Brookings team for not only producing an important groundbreaking report, but also for having the vision to think broadly about our country's engagement in the modern world and to help us to become what you could call more globally fluent. I think the problems are in exporting are cash and prejudice. And I think this report addresses those problems. Now, I care about this because I've spent a third of my life living out of a suitcase. In fact, my wife discounts the 36 years of our marriage by 12 years. So I am totally behind this vision. And 20 years ago, I actually discovered the importance of metro in, of all places, Wuhan, China. I arrived there exhausted from a long trip to have dinner, reluctantly, with a group of people sitting in leather jackets that barely spoke English. And I thought, who are these people? Well, it turned out that they were the Robert Moses. Some of you may know Robert Moses, of China. I mean, these people had in the 4 years before that built all by themselves without help from the Japanese or the Americans or whoever, huge bridges, huge infrastructure, hotels, airports, and everything. In other words, had transformed a sleepy town into an export center. Pure drive and initiative. So that experience taught me to think from the bottom up and recognize the importance of the metropolitan level everywhere, including the United States. And that is what Bruce and his colleagues do. So as a Brookings trustee, I'm a very enthusiastic supporter. They are a true think tank with fresh ideas who focus on the critical message that being global in metros matters. It matters to the health and the prosperity of the nation. I've only one request for the next report, if I may be so free, is, don't just focus it on the US. I tried last night to find some data on the big export centers in Europe. Nada. Very hard to find. And it would be very interesting to put it in a context. So as my brother lives in Stuttgart, as part of the Van Akmaal diaspora, I found the data on Stuttgart with some effort. And it's interesting. Compare Stuttgart to your largest metropolitan centers. Stuttgart, of course, is, Germany is the main exporter in Europe, and Stuttgart is the export area in Europe. So we're not talking, second rate. Now we're talking really the best of the best. Now, what is the best of the best? Well, compare Stuttgart with the Detroit area. Detroit, according to your data, has 27 billion in exports. Stuttgart has 56 billion in exports. In Detroit, that is 15% of its GDP. In Stuttgart, it's 50% of its GDP. And what's the difference? They really help small and medium-sized companies. Immelt, on Monday night, said exactly the same thing. That's what it is all about. So, in the context of the, I just want to first start with kind of looking at an idea that has become commonplace, which is that we are losing the race for global competitiveness. That's what you find. And I have to admit, in my own book, The Emerging Market Century, I contributed to that idea because I think there was a problem. And there were some good reasons for kind of a sliding feeling that we had. I mean, others overtook us in drive. Look at how China builds infrastructure. I don't need to say anything more about that. You know, they've built an impressive manufacturing platform. India, an impressive back office platform in record time. Drive. 2. We no longer make cheap goods. Consumers in the US began to feel that everything they bought in Walmart came from China. We are doing a lot of other things that we are not noticing. We lost our virtual monopoly on innovation. Germans, other Northern Europeans, Japanese are beating us now in making and exporting complex machinery, high value-added components, and many environmentally conscious products of the future. Our share of global R&D, patents, etc. is declining, even though the world would have trouble living without iPhones, iPads, Google, Amazon, and Bloomberg. All US innovations. Our brands have lost some of their luster. The cachet of American-made cars, planes, phones, and machinery for the rising middle class in emerging markets seem to have dwindled, although it's coming back in China. 5th, the US seemed to have missed the boat in becoming a leader in a more environmentally conscious world as it ceded ground to mass production in China and innovation in Europe. We were talking about that this morning at breakfast. And finally, and I think most disastrously, our infrastructure is now second rate. It used to be first rate, it's now second rate. We have not kept up. Domestic political antagonism at the national level, combined with a sense of being overwhelmed by the budget and the debt crisis, has placed the onus on expense cutting rather than building for the future. Well, yes, President Obama has called for proactive promotion of manufacture and export competitiveness, and also for the need to rebuild our infrastructure. But this top-down message has not really gained the traction it deserves. As a result, we are falling behind. Now, after this litany of problems, you might think that I'm a pessimist. Actually, I'm not. You may start to despair, but you have no reason to despair. Not so fast. There's actually some rather unnoticed but very important good news when it comes to global competitiveness. Let me make 6 points. First one. This is a game changer. Let me repeat it. What I'm going to say now is a game changer. The US built its industrial power on cheap energy. For a while, we lost it, and now we have it back. The answer is shale gas. Gas is cheaper in the United States, to be exact, 3 times as cheap as in the rest of the world. 3 times or more as cheap. We have companies from Chile that used to get Argentinian gas moving to Texas because it's cheap. Remember, cheap is not just labor. Energy is in most industries much more important than labor as a cost. We are now cheapest in the world when it comes to the energy needs most used by industry. Let's not forget that and build on that. This is an incredible opportunity. 2, I think the way we gather statistics, with the exception of the Metropolitan group, because they actually do it the right way, but we gather statistics the wrong way. We gather the statistics as if we're still living in the 19th or at best 20th century. But we aren't anymore. We live in the 21st century. We have to do this in a different way. I believe that if we measure it right, and if we look at the true impact of the computer, the internet, the smartphone, if we do that and realize that we are not only the inventors, but the first users of these, that we would see that actually our productivity has improved much more than we have measured it. And that means export competitiveness. Third, we're actually regaining some of our competitiveness the old-fashioned way. Let's face it, I mean, we have had miserable wage growth. Not in China, not in India. In fact, Mexican wages are now lower than Chinese wages, by the way. And Mexico is closer to the United States, if you haven't noticed, than China. And Imot, for example, mentioned that if you pay on the factory floor $15, you can compete with people who pay $3 in China, and that's the going rate there. So this story that we can't be competitive on a wage basis, I think is old hand. Fourth, we talked about this at breakfast, belatedly, much belatedly, finally, but necessarily, we're finally beginning to focus again on manufacturing. I don't know what took us so long, but we finally are. And it's a problem. And the problem is that we lived under a delusion. The delusion was that, you know, as long as we're really high-tech and have wonderful things like Apple, etc., the manufacturing jobs will follow. It was another trickle-down theory that didn't trickle. Because we have created massive jobs with IT in China. The ratio of jobs created by IT abroad versus the US is 10 to 1. That should be 3 to 1 and could be 3 to 1. Finally, on infrastructure. Okay, we're behind. Let's face it, it's bad. There are a lot of things that need to be done. But one piece of good news is that the stimulus was so slow in comparison to China, which was very fast, that at least the return on the investment we got after all these reviews is going to be a lot higher. And actually, we're beginning to see some good news there. So, I think that we are more competitive than we think. And what we have to overcome is not lack of competitiveness. What we have to overcome is lack of confidence. And let's start with that today. Now, as Bruce undoubtedly will emphasize later today, things look worse from the top down than from the bottom up. And that's one of the great things of what you will see in this book. True, major challenges remain, but there's evidence of shifts underway. In this vein, Brookings research and on-the-ground efforts are having a tremendous impact in helping our nation's metros pivot to an outwardly focused, globally networked game plan to ensure the US remains a major global leader and competitor. I hope policymakers, business leaders, elected officials, and opinion shapers pay really close attention. And if I looked at the sightings last night on Google of this report that isn't even out yet, it's not doing too badly. I think this is important, and the conclusions that Bruce is about to introduce to you represent a strategy for advancing US competitiveness through growth in productivity, exports, and trade. So let me now introduce Bruce. All of you know Bruce, but I'll do it anyway. He's the founder of the Metro program in 1996, a program that all of you know that really does what a think tank needs to do. It has solid data, empirical analysis, and good ideas. Under Bruce's leadership, the program is advancing a paradigm for the next economy that is export-oriented, low-carbon, innovation-fueled, and opportunity-rich. Can't be better than that, right? In addition to leading the Metro program at Brookings, Bruce is also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, as if he needed more academic credentials. And before that, was chief of staff to Henry Cisneros at HUD. Bruce, thank you.
Morning, everyone. I want to thank Antoine for that. And my regret is I have to give a talk now because I was in the middle of tweeting just about everything you were saying. But the level of confidence that you have, I think, is shared, frankly, by many of the people in this room and by many of the business, political, and civic leaders from cities and metros around the country. Your leadership here and your guidance to our program is really second to none. So thank you. Just at the beginning, I just want to thank also J.P. Morgan Chase and the Rockefeller Foundation, because what you're going to see here today is a combination of empirical analysis and policy and practice innovation. And those two institutions have enabled us to do that. So thank you to them. For the past 3 years, our program has been boringly consistent about the economic challenges facing our country and the metro areas that drive the national economy. At the most basic level, the U.S. needs more jobs, 12.1 million by one estimate, to recover the jobs lost during the downturn and keep pace with population growth and labor market dynamics. Beyond job growth, we need better jobs to grow wages and incomes for lower and middle class workers and reverse the troubling decades-long rise in inequality. So there's no easy fix to achieve those two goals. Our economy must be restructured from one focused inward and characterized by consumption and debt to one globally engaged and driven by production and innovation. Or in our formulation, we must now move towards an economy that is driven by exports, powered by low carbon, fueled by innovation, rich with opportunity, and led by metropolitan areas. So our primary focus on exports and trade and investment more broadly is driven by both cyclical and structural concerns. So in the rubble of the Great Recession, household wealth has plummeted with the collapse of the housing market. Now, constraints at home contrast sharply with growth abroad as rising nations and their rapidly growing cities and metros come online. 2009, Brazil, India, China, the BRICS accounted for about a fifth of global GDP, surpassing the U.S. for the first time. By 2015, the BRICS share will grow to more than 25%. Now, these nations are growing precisely because they're urbanizing and industrializing, and the locus of economic power in the world is shifting. The top 30 metro performers today are almost exclusively located in Asia and Latin America. The 30 worst performers are nearly all located in Europe, the United States, and earthquake-ravaged Japan. This is not a rocket science. In the near term, over the long haul, the United States, our firms, our states, our cities and metro areas, our NGOs like hospitals and universities must trade more goods and services seamlessly with the new world, this new metro world, and by so doing, grow more jobs and better jobs. So today we're going to take a bottom-up look, as Antoine said, at how well we're doing by examining export growth in each of the top 100 metros. This is both an update and an expansion of a report and an interactive data platform that we developed 2 years ago. And I want to commend the co-authors of this report, Emilia Strada and Nicholas Marchio, for just superb, diligent, persistent work. We make 3 findings today. First, exports are leading the national economic recovery and having an outsized impact on job creation. As you will see, the United States not only remains a manufacturing powerhouse, but is the world's leading provider of advanced services. But as the locus of economic power shifts, the geography of exports is shifting towards the rising nations, particularly Brazil, India, and China. Second, metros are leading national exports because they concentrate and agglomerate many of the leading tradable sectors in the economy. Taking together, the top 100 metros dominate U.S. exports in general and with regard to the rising economies in particular. But unlike retail or housing, these are not cookie-cutter economies. Each metro has a distinct export profile and a special set of trading partners. Finally, metros are driving innovation in practice, in policy, in the formation of global trade links. They are, in essence, building an export economy from the ground up by innovating locally, advocating nationally, and networking globally. They are beginning to act like the economic engines they are. Let me begin with our first macro finding. Exports are leading the national recovery and having an outsized impact on job creation in the United States. With consumer demand depressed at home, U.S. companies are looking to global demand for growth. Export sales grew by more than 11% in 2010 in real terms, the fastest growth log since 1997. Exports were responsible for 46% of GDP growth between 2009 and 2011, which is absolutely remarkable since exports make up only 13% of the GDP of the United States, compared to 30% in China, 29% in Canada, and higher levels in India, Japan, and the entire EU. Now, the result of fast export growth at home has been fast job growth. The U.S. added nearly 600,000 new export-supported jobs in 2010. About a third of those come from exporting firms and industries, and the remainder in supporting positions in suppliers, servicers to the exporters, and transportation and wholesale traders hauling merchandise goods across the country. These are not just more jobs, these are better jobs. Export-intense industries are more likely to provide health and retirement benefits, and wages are on average roughly 11% higher in firms that export for both production and non-production workers. In fact, wages in many of the top exporting industries, machinery and transportation equipment manufacturing, business and professional services, chemical and computer and electronic product manufacturing, far exceed the national average wage. So what's happening here? For all the talk of a post-industrial economy, the United States remains a manufacturing powerhouse, exporting more than $1.25 trillion in manufactured goods in 2010. This made us the second largest merchandise exporter in the world, behind China, but surpassing Germany just by a bit. Manufacturing comprises 61% of U.S. exports, but has driven the export resurgence in 2010, contributing 75% of U.S. export growth in the first year of economic recovery. Over 64% of that manufacturing growth came from just 4 sectors: transportation equipment, chemicals, machinery, and computer and electronic products. To paraphrase the old motto for Trenton, what the United States makes, the world takes. But this is not just about the advanced manufacturing of high-value goods. America is the #1 exporter of private services in the world, exporting $518 billion in services abroad in 2010, which gave us a $153 billion trade surplus in services. In 2010, U.S. exports of private services represented 14% of global exports, more than double the share of Germany, the second-ranking country. 3 service export sectors, education, telecommunication services, and business services, grew both in 2009 and 2010 and represented 30% of all service exports in 2010. The education sector, expenditures of foreign students in the United States, is growing by leaps and bounds. We now have more than 720,000 international students studying in the United States, led by those from China, India, and Korea. And that sector represents $21.2 billion in U.S. service exports. U.S. exports are not only growing, they are shifting to the economic powers in the world. Our North American trade partners remain the largest export markets. Canada and Mexico are the destination for 1/4 of U.S. goods and service exports in 2010. Japan, China, and the United Kingdom round out the top 5 destinations for U.S. goods and service exports in that year. And taken together, these countries accounted for 43% of U.S. exports. But we're seeing a shift in the sources of U.S. export growth, both concentrating and shifting to rising powers. Pre-recession, between 2003 and 2008, 5 countries, Canada, China, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Germany, contributed 32% of U.S. export growth. Post-recession, from 2009 to 2010, these 5 nations Canada, China, Mexico, Korea, and Brazil accounted for a staggering 58% of export growth. We have entered a new world economic order. So that leads to my second point. Metros are leading national exports. Any discussion of exports must begin with our large metro areas, the heart of the American economy. 100 metros that take up 12% of our landmass, house 2/3 of our population, generate 3/4 of our GDP. This is the new economic geography here and abroad: cities, suburbs, exurbs, and rural towns. So our report shows the extent to which these top 100 metropolitan areas in the aggregate drive state and national exports. In 2010, they produced an estimated 65% of U.S. exports, including 63% of manufactured goods and 75% of services that are sold abroad. They produced a majority of state exports in 30 states in 2010 and a supermajority, more than 60%, in 20 states. In addition, they are our export job centers, reflecting their position not only as the producers of goods and services sent abroad, but the hubs of supply chains and export logistics, supporting 64% of total export jobs in 2010, including 61% of jobs supported by manufacturing and 75% of jobs related to service exports. So metros, of course, do not exist in the aggregate. They have distinctive starting points and distinctive assets, attributes, and advantages. Our research digs deep to unveil the export profile of each of the top 100 metro areas. So here are our supersized performers. LA and New York, which both exported nearly $80 billion in 2010, and Chicago and Houston, which topped $48 billion that year. The top 100 metro exporters, or the top 10, include Dallas, San Francisco, Seattle, Philly, Boston, and Detroit. I'm still recovering from the Stuttgart comment, which all exceeded $26 billion in exports. Taken together, these metros account for 28% of U.S. exports. This is not just about the large diversified economies. These 10 metros saw the fastest manufacturing-driven export growth, all having more than 88% of their 2009 to 2010 export expansion coming from goods production. And a completely different set of metro areas, mostly in the Northeast, are implicated by the rapid rise in education exports. Boston leads, with education providing almost 5% of total exports. Now, the varied spatial geography of our export economy comes through all these graphics, and it's a critical point for national policymakers and state and metro leaders alike. The export economy, unlike the consumption economy, is highly differentiated. A Walmart outside Phoenix is the same as a Walmart outside Pittsburgh. Same design, same footprint, same goods. A housing subdivision outside of Denver is the same as one outside of Detroit. But what Phoenix exports is different from what Pittsburgh sells to the world. And what makes Denver a special global metropolis is different from what drives Detroit. Every U.S. metro presents a different economic face to the world. One group of metro areas, largely in the Midwest, benefits from the growing trade of cars and trucks to China. Another group, very regionally diverse, drives the growing trade of basic chemicals and pharmaceuticals to Brazil. And still another group, also regionally diverse, dominates the non-ferrous metal products which are sold to India. So that leads to our final point, namely that metros are starting to drive innovation in policy, in practice, in the formation of global trade links. This is a major structural shift. Setting and stewarding a strong export economy has traditionally been almost the exclusive role of the federal government, given its powers over trade, taxes, and currency, and investments in innovation, human capital, infrastructure, and export promotion and finance. Yet with partisan gridlock, even the easy stuff, reauthorizing the Ex-Im Bank, and Chairman Hochberg will be here, modernizing freight infrastructure has become extraordinarily difficult. In this polarized environment, cities and metropolitan areas, already the engines of the national economy, are doing double duty and helping set a strong pro-trade platform for an export nation. So 3 things are happening. First, metros are innovating locally with export plans that exploit their distinctive competitive advantages in the global economy. Over the past year, Brookings has worked closely with leaders in 4 metropolitan areas, Portland, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Syracuse, to invent and pilot actionable export plans. This activity has been done in close partnership with the International Trade Administration and supported at the local level by U.S. Commercial Services, the SBA, and Exim Bank. So the elements of export planning and action are pretty simple and straightforward. Each metro does a market assessment of their unique export profile and potential, what goods and services they trade, which nations they trade with, where trade trends are likely to head given market dynamics here and abroad. Armed with that information, metros then set exporting goals and objectives that build on their distinct advantages, devise strategies to meet those goals, and establish metrics to gauge progress. All those efforts are undertaken by a consortium of corporate, government, university, and civic institutions that cut across jurisdictions, sectors, and disciplines and collaborate to compete globally. So the elements of export plans are not new. They just adapt the lessons of private sector business planning, evidence-based, solution-oriented, performance-measured, to the task of revitalizing and restructuring metro economies in a globalizing era. Let's take a quick look at the 4 plans, and you might focus especially on the distinctive industry focus of each plan and the remarkable collaborations that have been built in each community. Let's start with Portland. The mayor is here and will be on a panel. Portland is export central, right? Enviable strengths, computer electronics, clean tech, innovation. It doubled exports in the past decade. Its goal, double them again in the coming 5 years by bolstering the computer and electronics supply chain and increasing the export orientation of its green cities expertise to serve an urbanizing world. LA is the nation's largest exporter. 80% of its exports concentrated not only in film and television, but also aerospace, computer and electronics, pharmaceuticals, and professional services. Its goal, create a new Los Angeles Regional Export Council to identify and proactively support export-ready firms in these leading sectors. The Twin Cities have core global advantages, starting with the health and medical technology sectors. Its goal, also double exports in the next 5 years by expanding export reach among small businesses and building off its distinctive base. And finally, Syracuse, New York, a small but highly diversified economy. Its focus, maximize its proximity to Canada, our largest trading partner, expand the sale of top goods and services exporters in the region, and build the export capacity of smaller firms. So these export plans are not an anomaly. They are, in fact, the beginning of a new wave of local and metropolitan economic development. Several months ago, Antonio Villaraigosa, the mayor of Los Angeles and head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, put out an export challenge to America's cities and metros. His goal is very ambitious, 25 cities designing and beginning to implement export strategies within the next year, and we will get there. So having innovated at home, metros are starting to advocate nationally for federal, state, and state policies and practices that boost their metropolitan exports. What do they want? Well, on one level, they want the federal government and the states to set a solid platform for export growth generally. At the same time, they want federal and state policies to be nimble enough to align with the distinctive visions and strategies of disparate metros. So let's start with the platform setting. For metros to realize their export potential, the federal government needs to ensure that American companies compete on a level playing field. What does that mean? It means a new round of trade agreements that open up foreign markets to U.S. goods and services. It means fierce protection of intellectual property rights of American businesses around the world particularly in China. It also means a steady, stable supply of ready capital and market advice so that companies, particularly small ones, can overcome the financial, regulatory, language, and cultural barriers that impede trade and job creation. Now, platform setting also requires the federal government and the states to work together to design and implement a national freight strategy that modernizes our air, rail, sea, and land hubs and corridors so goods can move quickly and efficiently throughout the country with the least environmental impact. It means the feds and states work together to invest in advanced R&D at scale over a sustained period of time, and then support efforts to commercialize innovation in a way that spurs and recharges American manufacturing and advanced services, the stuff that we actually sell abroad. And also, feds and states working together to help provide a steady stream of skilled workers to export-oriented industries via strong support for community colleges and STEM education that focuses on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Yet in today's competitive environment, merely setting a platform for trade is not sufficient. To maximize efforts, the feds and the states have to align policies and investments with metropolitan visions, goals, and strategies. So what would that mean? In Minnesota, as discussed before, the State Trade Office is a lead organization in that Metro Export Initiative. We have a representative here today. State leadership is absolutely critical because it brings real resources, programs, and tools to the table, serves as a unified voice for a metropolitan area like most metros that are deeply fragmented, and helps coordinate overseas marketing and trade trips for all in-state metros. Now, alignment's also imperative for the federal government. President Obama, to his credit, has proposed consolidating 6 agencies involved in trade activities: U.S. Department of Commerce's core business and trade functions, the SBA, Office of U.S. Trade Rep, Export-Import Bank, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Consolidation would be a failure, in our view, if it just moved agency boxes around in Washington, D.C. The key to success is to integrate activities on the ground so that local reps, the federal export agencies, such as the U.S. Export Assistance Centers, Small Business Development Centers, operate as a unified team with metro leaders. One set of export objectives, one set of performance metrics, a clear system of referring clients and sharing information. Last piece to the export puzzle. Beyond innovating locally, advocating nationally, U.S. metros are starting to network globally, creating and stewarding close working relationships with trading partners in both mature economies and rising nations. So strong connections already exist. Metros with concentrations in financial services, like New York, are forming tight, interlocking networks with similarly focused metros around the world. Metros with concentrations in advanced manufacturing, like Detroit, are similarly linking with metros in both developed and rising nations. And port metros, like Los Angeles, are making key connections with the world's air, rail, and sea hubs. Now, these networks obviously start with firms that do business with each other, but over time they extend to the supporting institutions, governments, universities, business associations that provide support for companies at the leading edge of metro economies. In Northern California, for example, the Bay Area Council has become a foundation of respected, actionable, up-to-date information about its global connections and networks, focusing on emerging markets like China and India, as well as mature economies like Canada and the United Kingdom. This platform is supplemented by the activities of private-public organizations like China SF, which acts as a matchmaker between firms wanting to sell goods and provide services to China and Chinese investors looking for investment opportunities in the Bay Area. So the Bay Area provides an insight from the ground up into how the global economy is evolving at the metropolitan scale. But in many respects, these 21st century networks are not new. They harken back to the way the global economy evolved before the rise of nation states, when historical trade routes flowed through cities and deep trading relationships were forged between cities. Between the dawn of the Common Era in the 15th century, a flourishing Silk Road connected cities in East, South, and Western Asia with their counterparts in the Mediterranean and European world, as well as parts of North and East Africa. So like today, each city had distinctive concentrations and specialties. According to one source, cities in China traded silk, tea, and porcelain. Cities in India traded spices, ivory, textiles, and pepper. Cities in the Roman Empire exported gold, silver, glassware, wine, carpets, and jewels. I finally get to use my history degree. You get the lesson. Like today, the city economies of the ancient and the medieval world were distinct economies, and places grew and flourished as they built on their special strengths and their distinctive locations. So let me end with this tantalizing prospect before we open up for questions. A new Silk Road is emerging as we enter what is clearly an urban age and what will be a metropolitan century. Cities and metropolitan areas are not only the economic engines of nations, they are the spatial backbone of global trade and exchange. In a world where people and societies now live, operate, communicate, and engage through networks, a new Silk Road is emerging as a super network of trading cities and metros, economically collaborative and globally fluent. For this country, the new Silk Road is a path back to shared prosperity, sane and sensible growth that works for companies, cities, and consumers. For the world, it is a path towards reducing poverty and generating wealth. Let's build it, let's nurture it, let's extend it to all corners of the earth. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions. I'm going to ask Amelia Strade to come up because she and Nicholas have just done a brilliant job. And, you know, I get to give speeches, but these people actually do the work. Question, David.
It strikes me that what is missing from your presentation, and particularly in response to your comments about our second-rate infrastructure and the need to focus on more training, is the whole issue of taxes, of public investment.
Right.
And for 30 years now, the mantra has been, Americans are overtaxed, Americans are overtaxed, slash taxes, slash taxes. Well, an obvious question is, we're overtaxed compared to whom? And if you add up all of the federal level taxes, all the state level taxes, all the local government taxes of all descriptions, and compare them to the gross domestic product, we have the third lowest tax rate of the 32 nations of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And that's been the case for a long time. Fundamentally, you know, this proposition has been a fraud. And it's been a fraud, sir, and I don't speak to you in terms of your own individual capacity or your own corporation, but it's been a fraud perpetrated, supported actively by American business, by the Chamber of Commerce, by the National Association of Manufacturers, and by the tremendous corporate funds which flow into various right-wing think tanks. And it seems to me, and it can't be done obviously in an election year, but it seems to me there needs to be launched a serious effort to lay before the American people the facts about our capabilities to pay for what we need to do. I mean, taxes are simply the dues that one pays for the opportunity to live in a civilized community. And I think that's been missing the dimension of what's been presented here this morning.
So let me respond. And David Rusk is the former mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a good friend. And I would respond in this way. Let's put aside for 1 second tax rates, federal, state, and local, and let's focus on what the United States invests in, right? Because I think in this town in a relatively short period of time, post-election, we will have a debate over the national tax code, and we will have a debate over national investments. So there's always a debate in the United States of whether we do have an industrial policy or not. We do. It's called housing and real estate. Right? If you look at, even with, as you've said, existing tax rates, what we invest in the United States through the mortgage interest deduction, through other housing-oriented tax expenditures, is in building homes and extending sprawl. What we do not invest in, with any level of focus and discipline, are the things that make us wealthy, truly wealthy. Innovation, advanced manufacturing, and ultimately export promotion and growth. So we can have a debate about tax rates. I think what we want to have a debate through this report and others is where do we invest as a nation so that we can spur another generation, another half century, another century, frankly, of growth and prosperity that is shared and inclusive. And I think that requires a new growth model, as well as you've said, an examination of taxes. Antoine.
Maybe you would be surprised, but I entirely agree with what you're saying. And in fact, you have only 5 minutes to introduce. I would have loved to have talked about it. I think we need more taxes. We have 16% of GDP in taxes. It's too low. And I also agree with what Bruce says, is that we don't invest. Going back to the advantage of Stuttgart, my brother runs the largest department store in Stuttgart. The retail space in this area here is 3 times the retail space that they have in Stuttgart. And Stuttgart is rich. It's really rich. So that gives you an idea of how we misinvest, as Bruce says.
Questions? Yep. Right here. Sandy.
Sandy Apgar. What proportion, both in amount and in structure, of this economic export economy is based on national security strategy, specifically for the U.S.? And in an era when we are now embarking on massive restructuring of the national security strategy and all that goes with it, how much will be affected by those decisions?
That's a very good question, and in fact, we address it in the policy recommendation, and I guess because of the briefness of the presentation, Bruce didn't include it, but in fact, the President launched the Export Control Reform Initiative in 2009, and we think that this initiative should be accelerated, especially nowadays that we see many manufacturers of products that used to contract with the military. They want to switch to civilian purposes and they want to export it. However, the export control system has been fully reformed, and this deeply affects manufacturers across the country, as we found out through our pilots, like, for example, in Syracuse, New York. So I definitely agree with you that there is a need to reform any kind of all these sets of measures, controlling information technology, computer, or any kind of manufacturing that would be used, that the military used in the past. We don't have specific information, to your point, about how much of the U.S. exports are related to security, just because, as you mentioned, it's very, it can be very large. The system is, the technology is advancing quite quickly. Right. So many things, that in the past was used by military and so forth, now this can be safely used for civilian purposes.
I was at the TED conference last week, and the head of DARPA gave a talk. So if anyone, watches TED Talks on their iPad or their computer, watch this talk. This is unbelievably impressive individual and an impressive institution. Whatever DARPA invents today, we will be applying in this, if we're smart, we'll be applying in the civilian sector tomorrow, as we've done with so many innovations before. But really remarkable set of an institution and really a platform for advanced growth. Other questions, comments?
I think related to the tax issue.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Ophelia Young of SRI International. I'm wondering if in your work with the metro areas, the issue of regulations come up. You know, we heard a lot about people, business community complain about the regulatory environment, where I mean more than just, you know, the intellectual property rights and all that, thinking about the regulations that have been, you know, constraining business and growing and export. Export control is one of them, but, you know, labor or reporting, you know. So I'm wondering if there's any areas that can really benefit from coordination between the metro level, state level, and federal level in terms of regulations.
I think that's a great question, and Ophelia and SRI are really wonderful partners with us, and you know, worked with us on this Nevada report on state economic development. I think what we hear from metropolitan business is the desire for predictability and certainty in regulation. As much as we hear any specifics about this particular regulation is particularly onerous, or this reporting requirement is particularly onerous, we hear a lot of rhetoric about that. But when we talk with metropolitan business, what we hear about is the lack of any federalist coordination, because the federal government is like Mount Olympus. The states, what would be below Mount Olympus? Someone must know Greek history. I guess I did, you know, something else. But, you know, there's really no sense of coordination between these different levels. And frankly, in some parts of the country, particularly the manufacturing states and the manufacturing metros, we've heard companies, both large, medium, and small, say to us, you know what, we would rather have a tight, ambitious, aspirational, renewable portfolio standard around clean energy, because at least we would know what it was, and at least then that would set a platform for us to begin to compete with the Germans, the Europeans, and the Chinese around the next wave of the Industrial Revolution, which is clean tech production. So it's interesting when you go below Washington, which is the land of rhetoric and polarization and ideology and partisanship, to the real world, where people actually live and do stuff, cities, metros, to some extent states, you do get a little bit of a different perspective on what people want. Still hard to get done, you know, to bring certainty and predictability in very contentious areas of regulation. But I would say that more than anything else is what we hear. Last question, and then we have a panel. Yep, and all the way in the back.
Jacker, I actually work for the U.S. textile industry, and I was wondering, when you mentioned doing trade agreements, looking at IPR, and then also credit, why there wasn't mainly a point of looking at trade barriers if you're looking at duty evasion, which hurts us, currency, subsidies, the things that those of us who are manufacturing domestically are being faced with, both in our FTA countries and then in other.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair comment, and I think if you look at Amelia's broader report, this was like the Cliff Notes, you know? If anyone remembered, do they still have Cliff Notes? I mean, okay, I just want to know. This was the Cliff Notes of the report. I think as you dig deep into them, what you'll see is a much more expansive view of what, particularly at the national scale, we need to open up markets and to have a level playing field between American and international business. But thank you for that question. We are now going to hear from a panel from our 4 export plan metros, ably moderated by Mary Jordan of the Washington Post. Thanks.